So, Mr. Rupert Spira, thank you very, very much for being here. It's a real privilege and honour to have you as part of this discussion. And thank you so much for inviting us into your home as well. First of all, how are you?
Very well, thank you, Johnny. And not at all, it's a pleasure to be here talking with you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. This is the I Am podcast, centred around potential, human potential and inner transformation. I understand it's something that you've experienced and I would love to hear more about that. So can you give us your definition of transformation? What does it mean to you?
Yes, it's perhaps not quite so much a transformation as a recognition of something that has in fact always been present and is always the case, but has not been recognised. I don't speak so much in terms of a transformation of ourself, but rather a recognition of our essential self, which we perhaps didn't recognise before because our sense of ourself was so entangled with the content of our experience, with our thoughts, with our history, with our memories, with our activities and relationships. So whilst everybody has the sense, I am myself, not everybody knows their self clearly because their sense of self is so mixed up with or conditioned by their thoughts, their history, their relationships. And so what I speak about, what I try to lead people towards is the recognition of their essential self. And when I say the essential self, I mean that aspect of us that hasn't been acquired during the course of our lives, the part of ourself that remains when everything that is superfluous to us or extraneous to us has been removed. Sometimes I liken it to undressing. Okay. When you undress at night, we take off everything that is not essential to us. Our bodies don't become transformed in the experience. Our bodies are just revealed in the experience. So I like the title of your podcast, I Am, because when we say I am, we refer to just the essential sense of being, just the fact of being.
Yeah.
When we say, I am this or I am that, we add something to ourself.
And that's the clothing.
And that's the clothing, exactly. I am a mother, I am a father, I am a doctor, I am a nurse, I am a bus driver. We're not always a mother or a father, but we always are. So once we've taken the clothing off, the I am refers to our essential being. The I am this or I am that refers to our essential being plus the conditions, the qualities, the limitations of experience. And as a result of this mixture of our essential self with the objective elements of experience, our sense of self acquires limitations, conditions. So it's a kind of psychological undressing.
Yeah. The podcast is called I Am for that exact reason, as to what is that essential I am. And I love the idea that even some of the sages, when in translating the original message, have sort of said, I am is who I am. There's nothing more you can add. There's nothing more you can be. That recognition of that for you, were there key moments where it sort of took hold, gathered momentum, or was it something that was always taking place for you? Or when that recognition, how did that come about?
I was interested in these matters from quite an early age, from my mid-teens onwards. And like many people, I travelled, not in fact physically, but more intellectually to the East to look for, because this understanding, although it is present in the Christian tradition, but it's buried underneath of layers of doctrines that have been added later on. So I couldn't find this understanding anywhere in my own culture. So like many people this was now the mid to late 70s, I went intellectually east to India and explored Indian philosophy. But again, like many people, I misunderstood what was being spoken of. Enlightenment, for want of a better word, which is awakening, is the kind of common word for what we're speaking of. And it was always, whether or not it was presented as such, I don't know, but I certainly understood it to refer to an extraordinary, exotic experience, better than any experience one could possibly imagine. So I spent 20 years really striving to have this experience, and in fact, as you said earlier on, to transform myself into a different kind of self, a higher self, an enlightened self, a realized self, And of course, it was a frustrating project. It wasn't until I was maybe 20 years, after 20 years, that my understanding began to change. And I realized that what is referred to as enlightenment or awakening is not an exotic experience. In fact, it's not an experience at all. It is simply the recognition of the nature of our essential self, not a self that we might become if we practice hard enough or study long enough or meditate sufficiently well. The self that everybody, not just those relatively few of us that are interested in these matters, but the self that all 7 billion of us are now, but simply haven't recognized because we, as I said earlier, because we don't see ourself clearly. That was really a turning point for me when I stopped seeking some extraordinary, marvelous experience. And I realized that what was being referred to was just my essential being underneath the layers of experience. What is this essential being that I am before what I am has been qualified in any way by experience? And that was a turning point. It was such a relief. I suddenly realized that what I was looking for was not at an infinite distance from myself. It was closer than close. I was already that. I was looking too far away. It's like the eyes, the physical eyes, trying to see themselves and traveling all the way around the world, looking for themselves. They can't see themselves, not because they're so far, but because they're so close. In fact, they're closer than close.
Yeah.
So that was a real turning point. This understanding that what is traditionally referred to as enlightenment, awakening, salvation is not something extraordinary, exotic, out of reach, only attainable if you become a Buddhist or or you subscribe to a particular person.
Or live a certain lifestyle.
Or lead a certain lifestyle. It's just the ordinary, intimate, familiar self that everybody already is before it is qualified by experience.
So how would you describe or articulate potential? And is it something that actually, this enlightenment, this awakening, are there moments for all of us, maybe daily, weekly, monthly, or whatever it be, where we're actually in touch with that? I know I'm talking perhaps from a sporting background, you get that, the in the zone moment that I'd have spent time in, where you kind of feel like you just transcend the boundaries of time. Because when we talk about human potential, quite quickly the mind goes to that, what can we do? What can we build? How high can you jump? And all these kind of things. But how would you frame potential? And are there moments for all of us where we may actually be in touch with this, even though we probably don't recognize it?
Yes. Let's go back to the image of our naked body with layers of clothes. So what is sometimes referred to as the ego, or the separate self, the apparently separate self, would be our essential self, our essential being, the I am, clothed in thoughts, feelings, activities, relationships, and so on. So most of the time our sense of ourself is conditioned by our thoughts, by our feelings, by our activities, by our relationships. And this gives us a limited feeling of who we are. Now, there are times, and I would suggest that being in the zone is one of these times, but there are many other times in life, not related to sports, where we are temporarily free of the limitations of our thoughts and feelings. In other words, we're just in touch with our essential self. We although we would not formulate it to ourselves as such, because we're not thinking about ourselves at that time, but we are free of the limitations of our thoughts, feelings, free of our history, free of our relationships. And at that moment, we are just pure, unlimited being. And it always comes with a sense of joy.
Okay.
Have you ever been miserable in the zone?
No, of course not.
You long to be in. Every sports person longs to be in the zone, because that's when they're relieved of the limitations of their thoughts, feelings, expectations, hopes, disappointments. That's when they're just pure free being. And that's when I would suggest in sports, but actually in any activity, that's when we perform at our very best.
Yeah, definitely.
So of course there are still limitations that we have as a mind and a body. If I was in a moment when I was free of the ego, I was just this pure being, I wouldn't suddenly perform brilliantly as a rugby player because my body hasn't been trained in that way. However, whatever my body mind was trained to do, it would do it at its very best as a result of that. So my potential as a mind and a body would be enormously enhanced by feeling myself to be free of the limitations of the ego. So it's to answer your question, it's very closely related to potential.
That's really interesting, especially about the training part. And when you mentioned about the joy, always being joyful in that zone, that definition of joy, all these definitions, when the word comes up, they can be so tempting to head off into the idea of what's joy? It's smiling, it's laughing, it's joking. But in fact, when you're talking about being in the zone, the joy you're talking about is clarity, it's deep engagement, it's absolute involvement and engagement. And sometimes people, as a rugby player, I tried to find that by thinking almost reverse engineering. I'm always joyful in the zone, so I'm going to kind of be joyful. As you go out onto the pitch, you start trying to smile and trying to laugh. Yes. And of course, it's completely irrelevant to that experience.
Exactly, because it's the trying to be, that is initiated by the ego or the separate self. That prevents you from being in the zone. It actually has the opposite effect. When you're naturally in the zone, basically what is absent is the trying, the sense of becoming, the sense of limitation. It's the ego that is absent. There is just your being and your performance. And I would suggest that it's because the nature of our being is joy. That's what the experience of joy or happiness is, just the awareness of being. And so when you're in the zone, you're relieved of all the limitations with which you've clothed your being, and you're just pure being performing. And it cannot help but be joyful, because the very nature of our being is joy or peace or happiness.
So when those boundaries are softened or dissolved of the self, and there's that almost more direct experience of the pure being involved, where does intention lie in that? Because I'm putting myself back on the field for the sake of an easier example. That sort of separate being, if you like, is maybe much more open, and I feel like I'm fully involved, but I still have a knowing of what I want to achieve. On whose behalf am I trying to achieve that? And how does it still rest if I'm dissolving that clothing? I still know that we need to score, and I want to pass the ball to someone, and I don't.
But I doubt you're thinking of any of that.
No, I'm not.
In the moment,
definitely.
You think about that beforehand. You think about it afterwards. If you were to watch footage of yourself and you were to describe to someone what was going on, you would say, "I was watching where my mate." Yeah. But were you doing that in the moment?
No,
you weren't thinking.
There's an allowing. There's almost like people call it the flowing.
You're in the flow. You're in the zone. What does that mean? It means you haven't separated yourself out from the whole as a separate entity. It's not me and everyone else. It's not me and my teammates and the opposition. It's just one experience, and you are part of the flow of that experience. You don't have a sense of, I am an individual, I'm trying to win, where am I? All of that comes beforehand when you're training, and afterwards when you're analyzing. And I'm not suggesting it's not appropriate to do that. No, you have to do all that. But then in the moment, you have to do it. You know this much better than I do, or certainly in sports. You cannot perform at your best when you're thinking.
That, in fact, which actually it interrupts the performance.
It interrupts. So really, that there is, I would suggest that in a way, there's no intention in the zone. You're so at one with the moment. You're not anticipating what's coming. You're just totally at one with the moment. That's what enables you to perform in a way. When we see people in sports doing things that most of us would think were superhuman, when you see something, you just think that I didn't know that was possible. How is it that person has performed at a level beyond what we think is possible? It's because it is beyond thought, that they've been relieved of the limitations of thought, of the past, of what's possible, what we did on the training pitch, what we worked out on the board. They've been relieved of all that, and that enables us. That's where inspiration comes from. it enables something inspired to happen that is not just an extension of our past, not just an extension of all the hundreds of hours on the training.
It's not a deduction or a calculation of what's
we had
before.
to do all that,
Yeah.
but then you had to forget it. If we didn't forget it, then everything we did would just be an extension of the past. It would be good, but it wouldn't be inspired. It wouldn't be great. You know, you well know your greatest moments were inspired moments.
Yeah, of course.
You thought afterwards, how did I do that? Where did that come? I didn't train to do that. Well, of course, it was you had to do the training, but then you had to forget it, be liberated from it.
Definitely.
That enables something new to come into the situation.
That's really interesting, because to reference that example, it's quite interesting when you see someone in my position on the field would have been in the middle of play, and often sometimes that deep involvement of the game came with a lack of time. Often when the action heated up and it was quite chaotic, there almost seems to be a surrendering.
Yes.
And you fall into that. You almost fall into alignment with the energy of the situation and just become at one with it, as you mentioned. But as soon as a referee might blow his whistle and put his hand up and say you've got a penalty and you're the kicker, you watch the difference in the body language as the kicker then goes into a space of, what about me?
Exactly.
Save myself, survive as my reputation. When all of that has disappeared, keep my past alive almost.
Yeah, exactly. The moment the whistle goes, you know you've got a penalty to take. That's when the ego rises again. What about suddenly me? You feel the weight of the country's expectations. Yeah. You project forward. What if I get this?
Yeah.
Or
what if I don't?
One scenario, my life will, the rest of my life will go in this direction.
By this,
if I don't get it, the rest of my life is that is of course crippling. But the moment before the whistle went, there was no sense of a separate I. You were just one with the totality of the situation, flowing with everyone, doing exactly the right thing at the right moment, but with no sense of I am a separate person doing it.
No, exactly. When I work with players, especially in the dead ball situation of kicking a ball, the concept is exactly that, liberation of everything. And in that space of liberation, whether you design drills that almost hand themselves over to that being the whole purpose of doing it, the inspired performance or just responses that you see in their ability, and it almost shocks them. And yet you sort of use a funny example of sort of saying, you know, that took us 2 minutes. Imagine what you could do with a whole week. But of course it's the opposite. A week later they come back empty shells of themselves, speaking about pressure and expectation. And it brought to me the concept about, or the idea, what are we doing? And this is a much bigger question when it's posed towards education and society and everything, but what are we doing with preparation for performance? Because you mentioned about you have to go through the training and the conditioning of the body, sports conditioning as it's called, fitness conditioning, but that training and that understanding, but it's so often aligned with the idea that is stress and suffering, and that stress and suffering will therefore result in joy as a natural outcome. And as for me, what that did was, when I got those brief moments of absolute joy, you attribute it not to the straightforward conditioning, you attribute it to the amount of suffering, again, in that almost Christian message of sort of, and I used to say, well, brilliant, if I want more of those moments, I need to suffer more.
Yeah.
So I would move away from the idea that it was important for me to be the guy in the changing room who left last, who beat himself up hardest for errors, who watched more and more video, who felt the most humiliated when things went wrong, the most shameful when mistakes were made, and the least joyful when things went well. Yeah, the least celebratory, the one that didn't do celebrations or kind of put his hand up and say, what a great game, I feel great about myself. It was almost, this is the route towards more of that joy, is about almost creating more habits of basically avoiding joy.
Yes. I think you've put your finger on it, Jonny. What is the one thing that everybody loves and wants above all else? Happiness.
Yeah.
And in our culture, we have been educated to believe that happiness comes about as the result of the acquisition of a particular circumstance, a particular situation, an object, an activity, a relationship. We think that happiness is the result of something that we do, achieve, acquire, own, etc. And as you say, we then strive towards whatever we think for us will be the cause of happiness, whether it's being the best rugby player in the world or the best musician or having a family, well, whatever it is for us, we strive towards that. We've lost the understanding in our culture that happiness is the nature of being. Happiness is where we start from. Happiness is what we essentially are. It's not something we can achieve in the future by manipulating our thoughts, our feelings, our physical body, improving our performance. None of that leads to happiness, although we've been educated to believe it is, and we push and push and push and push for this elusive goal of happiness, which is considered to be in the far distance. No, happiness is the very nature of our being. And in fact, let's take a situation in, let's just say, football. While the game is building up, there is tension, expectation. You're going towards something. That's not a state of joy. It's a state of expectation. But when the goal is scored, there is an immediate release of tension.
Yeah.
You're no longer going towards something. You're where you want to be. Surprise, surprise, you feel joy.
Yeah.
Of course, the mind says, I feel joy because we scored the goal. No, the joy isn't caused by scoring the goal.
It's the release.
Scoring the goal brings the state of expectation to an end. It brings the thoughts and feelings to an end. And as a result of that, the joy which was already there, already present in you, the joy which is the very nature of your being, at that moment was able to shine. Previously, it was clouded by the expectation.
And the need, yeah.
But the mind misinterprets it. I feel joy because I won the game. Well, if that was the case, once you've won a game, you'd be joyful for the rest of your life, are you? 2 minutes later, no, you're not. Why? Because the mind rises again. It's the next game. This tension, the expectation builds up for a week and then you score the goal. There's a release of tension, and that joy, you think, there you are, the joy. It must have been caused. I felt it again when I scored a goal. No, that wasn't the cause of the joy. It was just that the expectation, the tension, the sense of becoming ceased, and as a result, the joy that is the nature of being at that moment was able to shine clearly. Now imagine if this understanding were to be part and parcel of your training, if you understood that you're not going towards joy, you come from that. Doesn't mean to say that we won't continue to train. All that is still important, but our happiness is not invested in the future. It's not invested in what happens. It's not invested in the outcome. Our seeking for happiness in the future comes to an end by definition, because we're feeling joy now. So the joy and the now always take place at the same time.
Yeah. The possibility of it is phenomenal, because even in the training, that concept of becoming is part of every training drill. As in, at the end of this, we will be here. At the end of this weight session, I will be here. Instead of the payback being instantaneously involved in the moment itself, such as I sort of reference this with that sense of flow, and that the things that pay back instantaneously are not a case of I will be like this once I've done this. It's the involvement in it, such as dancing. Nobody really dances because they think, once I've finished dancing, then I'll feel good. It's the dancing itself. And that's what I describe as almost on the field in that moment, is you're not seeking anything. You're expressing.
Yes.
You're expressing.
Yes. Dancing's a very good example. If you're a dancer or a musician, a violinist or a pianist, you cannot perform tense. So those are good examples where any kind of tension, any kind of expectation, any kind of fear, all
Absolutely.
of these tension, expectation, fear, they all come from a separate sense of I, a sense of ego. How am I doing? What do people think of me? What's going to be as soon as that comes in, that fear, anxiety, tension, expectation, worrying about what other people think, it translates into tension in the body. And exactly the same in rugby, exactly the same in all sports, and not just in sports, in any field of life, really.
Yeah, and physiologically, it makes perfect sense in terms of the efficiency of the body, and so many people will get this, but getting it and truly experiencing it are really interesting different things. And when you mentioned about that tension, that stress, the interesting thing I would have experienced in the dressing rooms I was involved in is that you have, from an external perspective, this understanding of people when they see these people, that there's so much fulfillment there And there's so much worth within the individual. The individual's so worthy because they're doing what they're doing. They must be so fulfilled. You go into the change room just before the event. I've not been in too many scenarios like that, but what you sense is an enormous fragility and lack, an enormous sense of I'm not enough. I mean, it's rife, almost to an extent that, not that I'd ever stereotype or group, but it almost goes hand in hand with performers to a degree, in certainly that there's this sense of I'm not enough. Yet in the zone moment, it's almost what is expressed is that sense of I'm all. There's nothing I lack. I am complete, which allows me to explore what I'm really capable of. And it's that expression of my completeness.
I think the sense of lack and unworthiness comes from allowing our sense of ourself to be conditioned by our past, by our expectations, by other people's expectations of us. As soon as all of those ideas are mixed into our sense of ourself, we then feel I'm not good enough,
yeah.
I'm unworthy. That feeling is translated into the body as tension, and we cease performing at our best. I can well imagine that before a game, a lot of people feel that. There's the expectation, are we good enough? And after the game, you feel the same.
Yeah.
But during the game, as soon as the whistle starts,
that's what everyone says, yeah.
You're relieved of it. This is why people, perhaps I shouldn't use the word addiction because of the negative connotation. This is why people are passionate about sport, because they know that although it's hell before the whistle goes, and for most of the game, you're relieved of this sense. Your sense of self is divested of your family history, your expectations, what the world thinks of you, how many people are watching on TV, what the outcome's going to be, what impact on my life is going to be. You're just in the moment, and that timeless moment, the moment that everybody longs for.
Yeah.
That's the moment that everybody loves.
In a way, for me, then hearing that, I really get the sense that, like you said, potential is liberated. It's sort of that sense of liberation that goes with it. And so many people speak about, it's in the world all around, but around our environment or my old environment, expressions before a game in order to try and calm that tension would be some really, really powerful messages, but they don't touch because they're almost reframed by the conditioning. Things like just be yourself.
They reinforce it.
They reinforce it. Yeah, just let go. Be yourself. Live in the moment. Don't worry too much about what's going to happen. But all of those things, they're so powerful, but they're also powerfully almost counterintuitive because they just be yourself. You then try and be yourself. It's not understood. It's that power, because also in the change room, coaches will look at someone, if someone's kind of in the corner just loose and reading the program before the game and kind of having a laugh with someone next to them, the most beautiful expression of ease. And for me, immense preparation. Yes. It's almost viewed as, hey, you get your head in. You're miles away. How dare you? Come on. You're not ready. Whereas in fact, actually, what they're saying is ready. Is look at this person over here banging their head against the wall, saying to themselves, I can do this. I can do this. Almost trying to reassure an obvious doubt.
Yes.
Whereas the doubt is missing in the person that's saying this moment is beautiful, it's enough, I'm enough.
Yes.
And I'm almost practicing and preparing and performing right now what I'm aiming to perform in 10 minutes time.
Exactly. Yes, there's no discrepancy between the mindset beforehand and the mindset during. I had a tennis coach once that I played with in America, and he at the time was coaching one of the top 10 under 14 girls in the world. And he told me a story about her that every time she made a mistake, she smiled.
Okay, right. Yeah.
It was brilliant.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the story.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Because what do we normally do when we make a mistake? We lose a point in tennis. There's someone, the opponent score a try or a goal to go. And we immediately, the separate self rises up and we go, we go down on ourselves. We blame ourselves or somebody. Immediately, we're out of the flow. We separate ourselves from the whole as an independent self, and then we blame ourselves if the goal's been scored against us. If it's us that scored the goal, we give ourselves credit. But either way, we extract ourselves from the whole and become a part. What does smiling, when you make a mistake, what does smiling do? It erases that habit. In other words, it places you back in the now. It counteracts the habit of the separate self or ego rising up and saying, I did it, aren't I wonderful? Or I made a mistake, aren't I awful? What's interesting about it wasn't a psychological exercise. It was a physical exercise because it was a smiling. It's difficult to be down on oneself and smile at the same time. It just erased the tendency of separating yourself out from the totality, either as a great success or as a great failure, and therefore placed herself in exactly the right position to face the next ball without fear or tension.
Yeah, it's immensely powerful. And you mentioned before a little bit about, which I'm really, really interested in, we were talking about liberating potential and how that references or coincides or corresponds with that feeling of being in the now. And that time issue, we've been speaking a lot about past and what that means, and yet direct experience, which I know is a great basis of that sort of self-investigation and non-dual understanding. That direct experience tells us only that there is just now, and yet we seem to rely on so much, me especially, in terms of this is what I've been through, according to my memory and my understandings of it, and it's made me who I am. Almost that construct prevents me from living in the now.
Yes, and it conditions your response in the now to whatever situation you may face.
Okay.
For instance, whatever you are now, whatever yourself is obviously present now. So if you were to want to make this investigation into who you essentially are, you wouldn't have to reach back into your past. No. You reach into your present experience because yourself is present now. So if I were to say to you, without referring to the past, tell me about yourself.
Yeah, you only have experience.
What would you say?
Yeah, I am.
Would you say, I am a rugby player? No, you have no experience of being a rugby player now.
But anything you talk about from a physical perspective would relate to the past.
Would relate to the past.
Yeah.
Even if I asked you that question in the middle of a game, if you could freeze the game, and I say to you, Jonny, don't refer to your past. Yourself is present now. Therefore, in order to access it or know yourself, you don't need to reach into your past. So don't refer to the past. Who are you now? You wouldn't say, I'm a rugby player.
No.
You wouldn't even say, I'm a person. You close your eyes. There are a few physical sensations present, but you don't actually have an experience of being a person. You just have the awareness of being.
Yeah.
Everything else that we add on to that experience limits ourselves.
And has to have come from elsewhere.
And comes from knowledge. So if we are able to have access in ourselves just to this pure sense of being, just the awareness of being, and for that to be the place where we live. And then, of course, we have a body and a mind. It still functions, but its function is to express the qualities that are innate in our being. In other words, our body and the mind is used in the service of being rather than in the service of a fearful, anxious, apparently separate self or ego. So all the qualities of the body and the mind that we train, all of that remains. That can be trained, but it's liberated from serving this illusory sense of a self.
Yeah. I mean, the concepts of, therefore, through knowledge and understandings and past experiences, whatever those understandings, or that's just memory anyway, but all that gathering, we're talking about that as potentially being the clothing.
As you say, from a very early age, we're having experiences that we resist. We don't understand them. We're not able to process them. So in a way, they get laid down in the deepest layers of our mind. And this storehouse of uncomfortable feelings that is laid down early on in life is then also translated into tensions in the body. And this early trauma, it builds up in us, in the mind, and corresponding counterpart in the body. To use our analogy of clothing, it's like layer after layer after layer after layer of clothing. And so by the time that most of us get to young adulthood, our sense of ourself is profoundly influenced by, dependent upon all of these traumas that we've experienced through our life. So it takes some unraveling.
Yeah.
You have to go back through the layers, all the way back. And not just the sort of one's surface thoughts and immediate feelings, but through the layers that have been accumulated in the mind and the tensions in the body, till we go all the way back through that to our essential being, the I am.
Yeah.
The I am before it is qualified by the content of experience. If we get in the habit of going all the way back there and resting there, that acts as it's like a kind of dissolving agent. The layers are gradually dissolved.
It's really, really interesting, because at times that you can apply some kind of logic to these things. You sort of see a situation, you kind of, that's because of this, and you can work it out. But there are times, certainly for me in my life, where things just come up out of nowhere. And then suddenly the mind is recruited by the feeling, or the feelings exacerbated by the mind's thought process. And suddenly you're down a space where you become almost a different person.
Yes.
And suddenly you're saying things, you're thinking, I would never say this. And I'm seeing things a certain way. They say, this is ridiculous to how I know myself to be. And yet you become consumed by those layers, if you like. Because
something in the current situation, which to somebody else might be so trivial that they may not even notice it. But for you, it triggers one of these deep-seated layers. Yeah. And it can be tiny. It can be just what your partner says to you in passing, or it can be the tiniest thing, but it puts you back. For that moment, you're a 5-year-old boy with your father ignoring you, or whatever the trigger has been. Yeah. And of course, to an outsider, it's completely irrational. Johnny, don't be silly. I said my name. But for you, it's very real. You are re-experiencing that trauma.
Exactly. And so it's really interesting, because like I said, there's that. For me, I had a very interesting relationship with, or when I say had, still have experiences of this relationship with a fear. And my understanding at the time when I was young was almost to overcome it, to protect myself against it, to stave it off, to conquer it, whatever it be. It was about perfectionism, achieving, and those kind of things, as much as they were probably more irrational from a young mind, and as they got more subtle through an older mind, but they're there in the way that you're thinking about things coming up, or the way that you're thinking about things gone by. And it's also part of, I think, everybody's experience, that there is a clothing there. What is that preparational, or that opportunity, and how does it take place that you can come to that direct experience of that I am, or we can sort of remove these layers?
Go back to the example you gave of fear as a child. What was it, or who was it that was afraid? What were you protecting? Well, you're not talking about fear of your body. You weren't in physical danger. It's not that kind of fear. So it was a psychological entity. It was your sense of yourself. You felt that you were afraid. You felt, I am afraid. But was your being just the fact of being? Yeah. Was it in danger at that moment? No. So it was something. It wasn't your essential being, and it wasn't your body that was afraid. Somewhere in between the two, there is this ultimately illusory sense of self that is afraid, anxious, and that it's quite possible to lead a whole life whose purpose is to defend and enhance that illusory sense of self. In fact, many people do spend their whole lives defending and enhancing their sense of self.
Without ever meeting that self, or getting a chance to.
Without ever investigating the self clearly enough to realize that there is something called a self, if we can call it so, that there is being, that there is the experience of being, if we can call that a self, or the self. But the self that is afraid, we're not talking about physical fear here, the self who is anxious, psychologically afraid, that self, when we look for it, is not there. And imagine if at those times in your childhood that you had felt afraid and anxious, that you had the tools to realize that fear and anxiety, they're feelings. But what happens if I go back further, take a step back from my feelings to the being, to the sense of I am that is behind. When we say, I am afraid, I am anxious, I am excited, I am in love, the I am is always the same. We're not always afraid.
No.
We're not always anxious. We're not always in love. We're not always excited, but we always are. I always am. So the fear is temporary, but the I am is essential. Imagine in those moments of fear as a child, if we had the tools to have not got immersed in the fear and then to have built a life around accommodating in it and coping with it, but had been able to go through, take a step back from the fear to the being behind it, and to realize that being is not threatened. Just going back to one's fear, that is the cure for the fear. You don't have to spend the rest of your life doing whatever one would normally do to accommodate the fear. All you need to do is go back one step further back to your being, which is already inherently free of fear. That is the cure.
But the interesting thing is, rather than take a step back, the almost conventional and accepted form is to take a step forward into it, to try and reassure the fear and feed it with reassurance and what have you.
Yes, exactly. To do something that will either get rid of it or to prevent us having to fully feel it. Yeah. So let's say we have the feeling, I am afraid. We go to the fridge, to the bottle, to the video, whatever our particular object or substance is. And sure enough, when you eat the food, have the drink, we are distracted from our fear. At that moment, we do feel relief from the fear. And as a result of that, we briefly taste the joy of being. Okay. But we wrongly attribute the joy of being to the sandwich, the beer. And we think, if I have more of that, if I do more of that, I'll get more relief from my fear. And then when you have the next drink, you think, yes, it does. Yeah. I do feel, in that moment, you're relieved of the tension of the fear. Yeah. The innate joy of your being briefly shines. Yeah. We wrongly attribute it to winning the match, to having the drink, whatever it is, and hence the addiction. And we spend our life in pursuit of objects, substances, circumstances, trying to get rid of the fear without realizing that what we actually experienced in that moment when the fear came to an end, it wasn't winning the match, scoring the goal, having the drink. It was in that moment that the tension of fear briefly came to an end.
Which is a possibility available at all times through stepping back.
And the joy of being, which is a possibility available at all times to all people in all circumstances, that joy of being just shone in that moment. And we felt relief from the fear just because our innate joy of being came out of hiding in the background, so to speak. It ceased being clothed by the content of our thoughts and feelings, and it just shone briefly, and we experienced that as happiness.
And so by stepping back, by going towards passion, joy, by going towards that sense of relaxation when everything is saying do the opposite, is that where that meditative
I think that there are two approaches, really. That was a physical approach. We noticed this correlation between joy, which is a feeling, and relaxation in the body. It's very difficult to be joyful and tense at the same time. It's very difficult to smile and for there to be tension in your face. What is a smile? It is a relaxation of tension. What is laughter? It's a full-bodied relaxation of tension. It's almost impossible to be tense and laugh at the same time. In relation to the 14-year-old tennis player, it's almost impossible to have negative thoughts about oneself. Have I failed again? And to smile at the same time. So there's this very close correlation between physical body and our emotional state. So in this case, it's an approach where we put the body in the posture, in the position that it is naturally in when it is free of the tension of fear, anxiety, expectation, and so on. If you release them emotionally, it has an effect on you physically. You release them physically, it has an effect on you emotionally. You mentioned earlier during the game, you drop your shoulders. Yeah. It's very difficult to be tense with your shoulder. What happens when you tense? The first thing you do. So if there's an emotional release of tension, your shoulders naturally drop. However, if as an exercise on the pitch, you say to yourself, breathe deeply, drop your shoulders, smile, that's a physical action, but it has an emotional counterpart. And you can do either. Just taking one deep breath, it's very difficult to be tense and to breathe deeply at the same time.
Yeah.
And because of this very close correlation between our emotional state and our physical body, it works both ways.
And so the exercise of meditation, is that more of a total approach to this kind of...
Yes, I think so. The smiling in between the points, the taking a deep breath, the relaxing your shoulders, that's something you do for 5 seconds in between while the ball's out of play in the middle of a game. But yes, as a general approach, yes, meditation, although it'd be nice not to use the word meditation because it suggests this something we do with the mind towards some kind of goal, whereas in meditation in this context would be simply letting go of all the thoughts, memories, feelings, expectations, and just coming back, sinking back into just the sense of being, the sense I am. So that just the sense of being becomes increasingly our sense of ourself, so that when we think of ourselves, we don't think, oh, I am so-and-so with this history, with this relationship, with these qualities, with these faults. No, just when we think of ourselves, when we feel ourselves, we just go to the experience of being. And that experience of being, if we go to that experience of being now, if we had gone to that experience yesterday, 2 years ago, 10 years ago, or when we were a 2-year-old kid, it's the same.
Yeah.
It's the same. It does not change one jot, whether we win the match or we lose the match. The pure sense of being before the game is identical to the pure sense of being after the game, irrespective of what's taken place during the game or what the score is. And that the nature of that being is joy, peace. So yes, the attitude that it would be to regularly undress psychologically, to go back to our original, to travel back in oneself through the layers of experience, discarding the thoughts, the feelings, everything that we've acquired, going back just to this pure sense of being and making that, to begin with it, we feel we visit our being briefly from time to time. But the more we go there, the more we feel we live there as that, to make it one's new default identity, to operate from that. And then so that one's sense of being is not just something one visits from time to time in between all one's other activities, relationships, but it is the place where one lives from that. Yeah. And my experience is that the more we do this, fewer and fewer experiences have the capacity to take us away from that. Yeah. So when someone says something to you now, which reminds you of the way your father spoke to you when you were a 5-year-old boy, you don't go back to the 5-year-old boy. You go back to your being. Yeah. Is your being affected by the words that this guy? No, they were just innocuous words. They didn't hurt you because there's nothing rose up to meet them and say, I don't like this. Yeah. No, your being was just open, just heard the words. No problem, the words don't hurt me. So it seems like a very small thing, just returning to one's essential being, the essential I am, and living from that as that. But it has a profound effect it would have a profound effect in relation to sports, but actually on relationships, on every aspect of one's life.
I completely agree. And within sports are an incredible mini nutshell version of everything, because within there you've got some really intense relationships going on. You've got the performance, you've got the leadership angle, you've got the health and well-being, which is another thing I might want to touch on in a second. But it's really interesting for me in terms of looking at how the past becomes that sort of gathering, if it's allowed to become a gathering. That therefore, in terms of what's happening now, understanding the opportunity in the way we respond to what's happening now to therefore not contribute to that. So I sort of, like you said about the smile, is that after a while, if your smile reaction to a failure or an apparent failure, but the smile and the reaction means it's not a failure, then there's no gathering for the future you. I know we're not talking about past and future.
It doesn't trigger the weight of your past history.
And so each one of those smiles and a commitment to saying, coming back to the being almost, is building that momentum of liberation. Almost for me, the sense of momentum gathered by each one of those triggers the more you delve into trying to reassure it, like you said, going to the bottle or the fridge or whatever it is, and to, if it's the constant recycling almost of that past, albeit different formulations of it when it comes out, the getting someone in touch with their potential is for them to liberate themselves from that cycle and to experience new and to touch that higher intelligence.
It's just to free them from their past conditioning.
Yeah.
Because if we're not free from our past conditioning, our future cannot be more than simply an extension of our past conditioning.
Yeah.
But to be free from your past conditioning, then there are no limits on the future. Of course, there is a physical limit, but the physical limit is so much less than the physical limit that is determined by our past.
Yeah.
And that's when inspiration comes in sports, but actually in any field of life. Take a situation in a changing room before a game instead, and you've lost your last three matches. And if you were then, imagine if you were not to refer back to the past, but if you could have some simple question, tell me what you know about yourself now without reference to the past. Would there be any fear or anxiety there? None at all. And how difficult is that to access? Would someone say, oh, sorry, I don't understand, or would you have to think, no, you can ask anybody, just tell me about yourself now, but don't refer to the past. Now, in order to answer that question, actually, you don't really mind what they are. The point is not to get an answer. The point is for that person, instead of going back to their past, where, as you say, all the fear and anxiety, they're going to their self. You don't really mind what they say in answer to the question, but you do want them to go to their self, to have access to their self, which in that moment is completely free of conditioning and therefore free of fear and anxiety. You are, just by asking them that simple question, you are placing them in the best possible position to play with freedom, innovation, creativity.
It's amazing. People talk about the stigma of talking about issues and those sort of things, but even the idea about these kind of conversations we're having within that environment, there would be a stigma to it. There's there's probably a stigma to meditation as an attitude.
It's for softies, weirdos.
Or people that not so much bowing out, but people that don't have that drive or passion, to go. But in fact, actually, it brings me to the next thing about with that side of being yourself, and how does that play with what you want to manifest physically in your world, your dreams and ambitions. For example, there's a lot being spoken about in terms of, the kind of law of attraction perspective of life and how the universe works in terms of the vibrational frequency of the individual and the thoughts and the whatever it be. How do you see that in terms of goal setting and achieving? Because from the physical perspective, identified with this is me, mind and body from the past, this is me, my clothing, it's very much I've got to do it. I've got to make it happen. I've got to compete against everyone else. I've got to compare myself to everyone else. I've got to be better, be more worthy. I've got to deserve it more, and so on. How does it work for you in terms of what you want to achieve, and how do you look to bring that about?
I think one thing that happens is that because one's sense of oneself is derived more from one's being than from one's intellectual, physical abilities, from one's past, and so on. I notice I compare myself less and less with other people. My sense of my own identity, I don't see it in relation to other people, because my sense of myself is not derived from comparison with other people. It's derived from my being. I think something that is quite often misunderstood is that people often think that someone who is interested in these matters no longer has any desires or ambitions. It's not that. It's just that one's desires and ambitions and plans and so on, they no longer rise on behalf of the fearful, anxious, insecure, depressed self. They come from somewhere deeper in you. They're still filtered through your character.
Okay.
So for this reason, different people desire different things. That depends on their particular mind and body. But one would no longer choose where one lived or the activities one engaged in or the work one did to compensate for this ultimately illusory sense of self, the sense of self that is built on fear and anxiety.
Yeah.
And therefore one's life, it unfolds more in response to the qualities that are true of our essential being, not the illusory self. So the peace, the joy that is the very nature of the being, our character as a person, including our desires, our ambitions, our plans, are informed by those qualities more than being a compensation for the feeling of lack, anxiety, fear, and so on.
Is that where, when people speak about finding your higher purpose, or when I say higher, I just mean you're finding your purpose?
Exactly. One's higher purpose, for want of a better phrase. The purpose of one's life is no longer to accommodate the feeling of fear and anxiety, or to numb it, or avoid it, or to enhance oneself. No, the purpose of one's life is for one's body and mind to express the qualities that are the essential nature of your being. And because the essential nature of our being is the same in everyone. Yeah. But the qualities of the mind and the body are different in everyone. So everyone is going to express this differently.
It's very powerful, because something I experienced, lifelong, just happened to manifest itself in the sport side of things as well, naturally, because that's part of life. And it was something that meant a lot to me. I had a 3 or 4 year injury period. And during that experience, probably what a lot of other players are talking about when it comes to the end of a career, where there was that sense of lack really shone through, because there wasn't the bottle and the fridge available for me, which was playing, covering it up by being in front of crowds, by having a huge goal I could properly my only way at that time was physical. So I had to be on the pitch kicking a ball to feel like I'm worthy. And then there was the kind of meetings and the reviews and the games and everything that was completely gone, not available. And therefore the lack was just saying, you can't appease me. A lot of players are getting that at the end of careers, and a lot of people are getting that in retirement stages, I imagine, and at various times during lives and everything. And a lot of speaking about that sense of lack and not fitting in, not belonging, unable to contribute, but also talking about no longer being able to find their passion, not having the same passion. A lot of them try and revisit that by going straight into coaching, attempting comebacks, going and doing this, going to do whatever they can to try and almost find something close enough to whatever it was. But when you're talking about that true nature shining through the mind and body, almost, is that a natural passion? Is that passion finding itself? Is that a movement towards passion? Or, because a lot of people are seeing passion as belonging in the thing. Rugby or sport's my passion, and if I can't play sport, then I'm gonna have to find another passion, and almost kind of try all these other things, and all these other clothes on, for example, that aren't gonna, they don't fit, doesn't fit. But if you go back into yourself, is that part of coming back to passion as well?
I think the crisis that a sports person faces towards the end of their career is that the activity that they have invested their identity in, their sense of their self, is coming to an end. And therefore, when all of that is taken away, there's a sort of empty feeling of not being valuable, not being worthless. And then to compensate for that feeling of emptiness, well, a reasonably healthy way of doing that is to go into coaching, commentating. And an unhealthy way, and there are well-known examples, you turn to drink But what are we doing in that case? We are engaging some kind of activity or substance to fill up or avoid the sense of emptiness that's left when the activity that we previously invested our sense of self in has come or is coming to an end. And it's a great opportunity. It's an opportunity that you are obviously taking. It's an opportunity not just to substitute one activity for another activity, but to have the courage to face the the void, the sense of lack, and instead of reaching for the proverbial bottle, whatever it is, to take the opportunity to explore, investigate the sense of lack. When I say, I feel empty, I am like, who is this self? It's obviously not my body. Is it my being? No, my being is the same now as it has always been. It doesn't fluctuate. It's that crossroads that you face at the end of your career. It's a great opportunity.
Yeah, sure.
But that would be a very powerful time to introduce this possibility that what the satisfaction, the joy, the peace that people really seek is not through fulfillment, through activities, relationships, substances, and so on. It is their own being. That would be the time a very potent time to begin this exploration.
Yeah, definitely. I think just the nature of it as well. It's. I find the idea about the quiet, peaceful, the sitting with, the allowing, the meditation, if you like, for that expression. It's a really such an interesting journey. Whereas people like myself might be used to is a bit more of a tangible one. Numbers and figures, you go into a training session, you've got your weights, you push this, and at the end of it, you get that immediate release of the hormones that make you feel like, wow, I've done a load of work, I feel good about myself. And you try and almost transfer that into, well, my meditation, I'm going to sit there for however long, and then this will happen, like you said, the Enlightenment idea, and then I'm going to get a boof moment where I'm going to go,
Yeah. It is very true. People often, I hear it often, I can't meditate.
Okay, all right.
It's like saying I can't breathe.
Yeah.
I can't walk. It's why? Because they have an idea that when you meditate, you enter into some kind of blissful, peaceful state really in true. Which there are no thoughts. No, what about if you simply change the definition, as you just implied a few minutes ago? You change the definition of meditation simply to this, that instead of avoiding an uncomfortable feeling, you face it. Is that something that anybody cannot do? So I feel this void, this sense of lack. And my impulse is to go to the proverbial bottle, whatever the equivalent is for each of us. Instead of doing that, and that is, of course, an avoidance of the sense of this is unbearable, this sense of emptiness, this sense of lack. I can't bear it. I want something or someone to distract me from it. And what about in that moment, if we said, no, I'm going to do the one thing that I've probably never done in my life. I felt this sense of lack from the age of 3 years old, and I've always more or less successfully managed it or avoided it. I'm now going to do the one thing I've never done, which is just sit down, close my eyes, and turn towards it instead of turning away from it. That's it. That's meditation. That would be meditation. It's not something you can't do. It's nothing to do with achieving a peaceful state or even changing one state. On the contrary, it's ceasing trying to change one state and simply facing something which one previously considered to be unbearable, but which actually, if we face it, we find it's not unbearable. It wasn't really the feeling itself that was unbearable. It was our rejection of it that was uncomfortable. If we withdraw that rejection of the uncomfortable feeling and simply face the discomfort of the feeling, it loses much of its discomfort.
Is it a reasonable representation to suggest that a movement in that direction is a movement towards the truer self and a movement away? And those two, if we use it in that respect, movement towards is a movement towards joy, and a movement away is a movement into anxiety and stress.
You're right. Instead of turning away from the feeling, we turn towards it. We open ourselves to it. We don't do anything to it. We just face it. We allow it. We welcome it. And that's the first step towards taking one step back and asking ourselves the question, okay, what is it that is facing this feeling? What is it that is aware of this feeling? I am aware of this feeling. Who am I? I'm just that which is aware of the experience. What I'm aware of, in this case, the feeling of emptiness, I, that which is aware of them, am inherently free of all these afflictive emotions. In other words, my nature is peace.
And the interesting thing, as we've mentioned at the beginning, is that the momentary glimpse of this can come at the idea of actually, when the game is won or the big moment happens.
Absolutely.
But it's so fleeting.
It's so fleeting. But two things. One, it's so fleeting because immediately the feeling, the ideas, the feelings, they arise again. Aren't I great? And so the separate self comes back again and obscures this
never
the
satisfied,
quiet
never
joy
happy,
of
needs
being.
more.
So it's fleeting. But not only that, we wrongly interpret its cause. We think it was scoring the goal, winning the game, having the drink, finding the relationship, buying the house. This is what caused the joy that I briefly felt. And therefore, if I try that much harder to win the next game, to get the next relationship, for the next drink, and in this way, there's an endless cycle of seeking, acquisition, fleeting moment of joy or peace, and then the next round of seeking is initiated, and eventually this leads to addiction. Whereas all that is required is to understand that this brief moment of joy that we felt was not caused by any of those objects, substances, activities, and so on. It was the cessation of the seeking, resisting impulse, and as a result, the shining, so to speak, of the quiet joy of being.
A lot of the talk around this is about coping, managing, dealing with these issues, which in itself, the very nature of anyone talks about, I've got quite a lot to manage at the moment. You sort of get immediately like, well, that must sound stressful. Whereas the sense I'm getting about this is that you're moving into a space that it's not, because it's boundless, it's not really a space, but you're moving into possibility.
You're absolutely right. To use an analogy, does the space of this room, when we came in here this morning, does the space of this, I'm caricaturing the space of this room, does the space of this room think, oh, goodness, I've got a lot to cope with now, I've got an interview going on, I better be... No. Yeah. Does the space think, is it under pressure?
Yeah.
Is it stressed? Has it got a lot to go? If we started arguing, what would the space do? Would it get uptight about it? Would it wouldn't mind at all.
Yeah.
Well, in a way, we, and I refer to us now as the space of awareness, the witnessing presence of awareness, that which knows or is aware of our experience. It is never stressed by what it is aware of. And that's not something we have to develop. It's not something we need to spend 30 years of our life training not to be stressed. No, our nature is by definition unstressed and unstressable. All one needs to do is recognize one's essential nature and make it one's starting point, make it the place where to begin with, we visit it, so to speak, from time to time, but increasingly we make it the place where we live. So it doesn't mean to say that difficult situations don't arise. Of course, difficult situations arise for all of us, but they arise, they don't immediately trigger this old series of associations. No, we just go back to our being. We recognize I am that which is aware of this situation, and that which is aware of the situation is free of the situation. It is knowing it is aware of it, and it is inherently free of stress. It doesn't mean to say that I dissociate from the situation and don't have anything to do with it. No, I may be required to be involved, to interact, to make a decision, to perform some action. But we do so not from a position of stress, anxiety, fear. Yeah. We do so from this place in ourselves which is free of all of those emotions and therefore best able to make a decision or to perform an action that is in service of the whole.
Yeah, inclusive, yeah.
That is inclusive, exactly. And it doesn't serve any particular person. It's the best possible outcome for all parties concerned, yes.
It's so powerful when, for example, in sport, the whole thing is based around how do you deal with pressure. But instead of beginning the first question of what is pressure, who's under pressure, how does that, because I know from my perspective, when I was 18 and just joined a new club and you're full of the unknown is a friend to you. And then suddenly, because you're open with it, you're unknown, the unknown becomes your friend. And then 5-6 years down the line when you've apparently won some things and people are talking about you and now you've got so much known about you from your past. And now all you talk about is pressure, expectation, fear of failure. And yet you look at the two situations, it is just player, pitch, ball, game.
Yes.
And yet one is seeing it as, opportunity, and the other is seeing it as failure, opportunity to
exactly.
fail.
Because to begin with, your sense of yourself was, at least to a large extent, it was derived from yourself. It wasn't derived from your expectations, your failures, your successes. Whereas 5 years later, you have an image of yourself. You're no longer really in touch with yourself as you really are. You're aware of an image of yourself, which is largely gleaned from what other people say about you and expect of you and criticize you. And so that you take that in, and it becomes your new felt sense of yourself.
What does that do for health and well-being in its terms around body and mind? Is there the obvious thing about being away from stress, being in that space of inspiration? For you, example from your experience, what does your life from a health and well-being perspective feel like compared to other moments where you might be able to compare it?
I think it has a very profound effect on health and well-being. And of course, the well-being of the body, the health of the body is very closely connected to our emotional well-being. So if our sense of ourself is derived from ourself, from just the fact of being, there's, as we've said, there's less stress, there's less fear, there's less anxiety, and therefore less need to compensate for those feelings and avoid them. No need to compensate through excess working, excess eating, excess drinking. We don't require continuous stimulation from substances. It doesn't mean to say, I'm not suggesting that we don't enjoy a glass of wine or that we never have a cup of coffee. I'm not suggesting, or that we may not work hard, but we don't do any of things as compensations for the increasing sense of dissatisfaction and void.
And is that where the word, just the simple thing of people saying you need a balance to your life, but when you're compensating and there's need, how do you keep those plates spinning? Whereas versus when it's coming from a place of...
Exactly. If one's sense of self is still invested in the content of one's experience, in one's past, in one's thoughts and feelings, one's activities, one's relationships, other people's expectations, then even if we were to impose balance on our life through a regime of diet, exercise, it doesn't address the underlying cause, which is your felt sense of separation. As long as that is active, however much yoga you do, however pure your diet, however much you exercise, that's going to make some difference. But sooner or later, the underlying tension that comes from this deep belief and feeling of ourself as a temporary, finite, separate self is going to emerge. And sooner or later, the cracks in our regime will begin to show. So I suggest the opposite approach, where we go first to the underlying sense of being, which is inherently free of stress, anxiety, and we make that our starting point, and that we then develop a life that is an expression of that, and that includes diet, exercise, but it's not, our lifestyle is then not a compensation for the sense of lack. Yeah. It is simply a natural expression at the level of the body and the mind with something that we are already in touch with in ourselves.
Yeah. One thing I'd like to sort of round up on is an interesting question, and maybe it'll bring up a few things, but one of the questions that hit me right in the middle of that injury period, when I suddenly realized a lot of the injuries I was going through were puts me in a way of saying, you may never play again. So at 24, that could be it. And suddenly I was looking back thinking, blimey, have I made the most of this? Yeah, I've won a load of things. And this started the ball rolling in this sort of space of being like, but that's nowhere near enough. So if it's not there, how do I ever get to say I've made the most of this career? And I thought, but that's going to be a life question. When my life finishes, whenever that is, I'll also be able to say, well, how do you make the most of life? How do you make the most of anything? So many people are talking about smelling the rose and making the most of every moment. But the question being, what is a life well lived? And how would you paint that picture?
I think a life well lived would be a life where we've had the courage to face all these feelings of lack, fear, sorrow, anxiety, and so on, instead of avoiding them, suppressing them. That we'd had the courage to face them, to explore them, and to penetrate through them, to go through them, to find a sense of yourself that lies prior to that, and then to allow that understanding to then inform one's thoughts and feelings and one's subsequent activities and relationships. So it would be a life where we cease avoiding, suppressing, compensating. We first have the courage to turn around and face the thing that we are fleeing from. To face it, uncomfortable as it is. It's not going to be peaceful, pretty. You're not going to sit there with a beaming smile on your face. It's uncomfortable. Having the courage to stay there and then to slowly sink down deeper than that, to go back through the layers of discomfort, the feeling, to make touch with this essential sense of self or being, and then to allow that to begin to inform our thoughts and feelings and the way we live and act and relate in the world, whatever that would mean for each of us. Same sense of being, but expressed differently in every single person's case.
It's I mean, the way that I've heard that expressed, well, not necessarily that, but I've had something expressed to me was the relationship between head and heart, in a sort of metaphorical term, I guess, more in that the heart when I was younger, and it was just exploration and expression and just that powerful sense of vibrancy, sort of almost clothing that or burying that with the head in terms of its ideas of what's right and wrong. And suddenly I found myself in a position where everywhere I went, I was almost, again, metaphorically stooped over because I wanted my head in there first, guarantees, everything's okay, everything's right, how I want it to be. And then it's like, okay, heart, you can come in. But the heart never does.
Yes.
Because the head still stays ahead. And it's almost that ability for me, in a playing sense, was to bring the head back and let the heart lead, which in terms of the relationship with the unknown is exactly that. As soon as that possibility was there, I wanted to flee from it. The concept that actually that it's okay in there, and that actually I'm going to take a step, a bit like in those cartoons where they start running and the step appears just before the foot hits.
Yes.
But you run anyway because there's a deeper knowing that the step is there, but physically, I can't see it, I can't feel it, I can't smell it, I can't touch it, I can't taste it, but I'm going into that space not because at the sense there was danger there and it was a irrational move from a physical perspective, but we're talking like you from a psychological perspective, just to say, let's go. And back to that change room idea of those very, very few that I knew sat there, and you sort of say to me, you ready for the game? I'm like, yeah, of course.
Yes.
Yeah, let's just see how it goes. We're trained, ready, excited. So let's go see. Versus me who was there going, but what if this happens after 10 minutes? You'll be there, won't you? And you'll do that. And I'll be ready to do that. And if you do that, okay. And if this happens, that head saying, let me just make sure that step's there. Okay, it's there. Off you go. And that was the end of the flow, but also the end of the health, the stress and everything that followed from it. But I think in the way that you've expressed it, that's exactly what I wish someone had been able to get to me. And as a final question, when is someone ready and when are they not? Because these messages are around everywhere. Because like I said, this is something I'm looking now thinking, and I know we could argue that I am here and therefore it's always been now that this has happened. But what would it have taken for that 21-year-old me who was firing into that kind of, I need this and I must get that next result, to start understanding and softening to this opportunity? Does it only happen when it's right? How does that come about? When is someone ready? Can everyone be connected to at every moment, or is there a time and a place?
I think the answer is to both those two possibilities you've just presented. The answer is yes, both of them. Everybody's essential being is already and always inherently peaceful, without resistance, without the sense of lack. So in that sense, at every moment, everybody has this potential to be completely at peace and at ease and full of joy every moment. Everyone has that potential just by virtue of the fact that they are, that they exist, that they are aware. At the same time, why it is that some people hear of this possibility once, age 16, and thinks, yes, that's true. I know that's true. That's what I want. What is it that somebody, their heart gets broken for the first time, age 20, and they realize, I invested my entire happiness in a relationship that ended in a phone call. I'm actually talking about myself. That ended in a phone call, and then the recognition I had allowed my happiness to be entirely dependent on a relationship which I projected into the future for the rest of my life, and it came to an end in a phone call. For me, at that moment, it precipitated this question that really was the driving force of my interest in these matters. In what can we reliably invest our desire for peace and happiness, when it is quite clear that if we invest it in anything objective, an achievement, an activity, a relationship, a substance, a circumstance, it is going sooner or later to come to an end. Yeah. And if my happiness was dependent on it, my happiness was going to come to an end as well. So if I don't want fleeting happiness, I want lasting happiness. Yeah. Where can I find lasting happiness? Now, why is it that I asked that question? I was 21, I think. Why is it that happened to me and not my next door neighbor? Jonny, I can't answer that question. I don't know. So in theory, yes, everybody has the potential at every moment to go directly to the peace of their true nature. What is it that makes some people explore that invitation and others postpone it or not explore it? I can't explain that.
Well, I guess something that's really powerful for me, I'm sort of enjoying your Being Myself book at the moment. And one of those things is, like you said, that understanding that your true self, whatever that is, isn't going anywhere. So as long as wherever we go, wherever I went with the games, wherever I continue to go, that opportunity will still be there at that moment and that moment and that moment.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the fact that as much as, I've felt at times alone, isolated and very, very lost, but the sheer power of that being is that it's allowing you to feel that way because it is so allowing.
Yes, exactly.
It doesn't resist it. As you said, the space of this room doesn't say yes and no to that. It's just, I'm always here.
If at that moment, when you had the feeling, I am lost, probably your attention went to the feeling of being lost, and then you compensated for it in your own particular. But if at that moment a friend had said to you, make the statement, I am lost, instead of going to the feeling of being lost at the expense of the I am, emphasize the I am.
Yeah.
That's always present. Yesterday you felt I am lonely. The day before you felt I am tired. The feeling of being lost, the feeling of being lonely, the feeling of being tired, that comes and goes, but it's always the same I am.
Yeah.
That would have taken you to yourself prior to and independent of the feeling of being lost. The feeling of loss would have dissipated as a result of your coming back to your being, which is not lost and doesn't need anything objective to feel fulfilled.
And that's bringing us right back to your answer to life well lived, which is, as uncomfortable as that, coming back to that feeling may seem at the time, to not give your whatever that experience is, that's where everything we're seeking lies.
Yes. Ultimately, even in sports, we think, what do you want? You want to win. If you knew that winning the game would make you miserable and losing the game would make you happy, which would you go for? You'd go for the loss. Yeah. It's not really winning the game.
No.
You win the game because winning the game brings the state of tension and expectation to an end.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, your innate joy briefly shines. That's the experience that everybody seeks. That's what everybody is doing. They're basically, we're all seeking the being that we already are. And I spent lockdown writing a book called You Are the Happiness You Seek. We are what we seek. To seek for it in something other than ourselves is a recipe for misery.
Wow. Rupert, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. I have no idea what time it is. How long we've been speaking.
Thank you, Jonny. It's been a pleasure. We could have quite easily gone on all afternoon.
Yeah, thank you. It's so powerful and so impactful, what I think you're doing. You mentioned what I'm trying to do, but what you've been doing for so many years. And yeah, like I said, I was I'd love to have been in connection with your message earlier, but it happened for me at the right time.
Well, Jonny, you had your own unique path, and it's because of your own unique path that you now want to do what you're doing now. You probably wouldn't want to do what you're doing now if you'd had this. So I think your path, it's been perfect for you, and it's beautiful, and that you've turned your experience into what you're now doing. And what I'm doing is I'm speaking very generally, not particularly to sports people, or I'm speaking to very wide, whereas you're tailoring this to your field, to sports people, and that's a beautiful thing to do. And like you say, I mean, the 20-year-olds that will benefit so much from hearing this.
I do feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be, but very much I think when people see sport, start to realize, as we've said numerous times, you want to speak about sport and you say, yeah, but this is actually the same for everyone. You kind of go, it's just people are very interested in sport. And it's a great way of sports people realizing that actually we can exist through sport, outside of sport, and other people who are not in sport realizing that actually they're all sportsmen as well if they want to be. We're all playing life in our own way.
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
And not at all. It's a pleasure.